A.1.5. Where does anarchism come from? Where does anarchism come from? We can do no better than quote the organizational platform of the libertarian communists produced by the participants of the Makhnovist movement in the Russian Revolution. See section A.5.4. They point out that, open quote, the class struggle created by the enslavement of workers and their aspirations to liberty gave birth in the oppression to the idea of anarchism. The idea of the total negation of a social system based on the principles of classes and the state, and its replacement by a free non-statist society of workers under self-management. So anarchism does not derive from the abstract reflections of an intellectual or a philosopher, but from the direct struggle of workers against capitalism, from the needs and necessities of the workers, from their aspirations to liberty and equality, aspirations which become particularly alive in the best heroic period of the life and struggle of the working masses. The outstanding anarchist thinkers, Bakunin, Kropotkin, and others, did not invent the idea of anarchism, but having discovered it in the masses, simply helped by the strength of their thought and knowledge to specify and spread it. End quote. Like the anarchist movement in general, the Makhnovists were a mass movement of working-class people resisting the forces of authority, both red, communist, and white, Tsarist capitalist, in the Ukraine from 1917 to 1921. As Peter Marshall notes, open quote, anarchism has traditionally found its chief supporters amongst workers and peasants, end quote. Anarchism was created in and by the struggle of the oppressed for freedom. For Kropotkin, for example, open quote, anarchism originated in everyday struggles, and the anarchist movement was renewed each time it received an impression from some great practical lesson. It derived its origin from the teachings of life itself, end quote. For Proudhon, the proof of his mutualist ideas lay in the, open quote, current practice, revolutionary practice of those labor associations which have spontaneously been formed in Paris and Lyon show that the organization of credit and organization of labor amount to one and the same, end quote. Indeed, as one historian argues, there was, open quote, close similarity between the associational ideal of Proudhon and the program of the Lyon mutualists, and that there was a remarkable convergence between the ideas, and it is likely that Proudhon was able to articulate his positive program more coherently because of the example of the silk workers of Lyon. The socialist ideal that he championed was already being realized to a certain extent by such workers, end quote. Thus, anarchism comes from the fight for liberty and our desires to lead a fully human life, one in which we have time to live, to love, and to play. It was not created by a few people divorced from life in ivory towers looking down upon society and making judgments upon it based on their notions of what is right and wrong. Rather, it was a product of working-class struggle and resistance to authority, oppression, and exploitation. As Albert Meltzer put it, open quote, there were never theoreticians of anarchism as such, though it produced a number of theoreticians who discussed aspects of its philosophy. Anarchism has remained a creed that has been worked out in action rather than as the putting into practice of an intellectual idea. Very often, a bourgeois writer comes along and writes down what has already been worked out in practice by workers and peasants. He or she is attributed by bourgeois historians as being a leader, and by successive bourgeois writers, citing the bourgeois historians, as being one more case that proves the working class relies on bourgeois leadership, end quote. In Kropotkin's eyes, open quote, anarchism had its origins in the same creative, constructive activity of the masses which has worked out in times past all the social institutions of mankind, and in the revolts against the representatives of force external to these social institutions who had laid their hands on these institutions and used them for their own advantage. More recently, anarchy was brought forth by the same critical and revolutionary protest which gave birth to socialism in general. Anarchism, unlike other forms of socialism, lifted its sacrilegious arm not only against capitalism, but also against these pillars of capitalism, law, authority, and the state. All anarchist writers did was to work out a general expression of anarchism's principles and the theoretical and scientific basis of its teachings, end quote, derived from the experiences of working-class people in struggle, as well as analyzing the evolutionary tendencies of society in general. However, anarchistic tendencies and organizations in society have existed long before Proudhon put pen to paper in 1840 and declared himself an anarchist. While anarchism as a specific political theory was born with the rise of capitalism, anarchism, open quote, emerged at the end of the 18th century and took up the dual challenge of overthrowing both capital and the state, end quote. Anarchist writers have analyzed history for libertarian tendencies. Kropotkin argued, for example, that, open quote, from all times there have been anarchists and statists, end quote. In Mutual Aid and elsewhere, Kropotkin analyzed the libertarian aspects of previous societies and noted those that successfully implemented to some degree anarchist organization or aspects of anarchism. He recognized this tendency of actual examples of anarchistic ideas to predate the creation of the official anarchist movement and argued that, open quote, from the remotest Stone Age antiquity, men and women have realized the evils that resulted from letting some of them acquire personal authority. Consequently, they developed in the primitive clan, the village community, the medieval guild, and finally, in the free medieval city. Such institutions enabled them to resist the encroachments upon their life and fortunes, both of those strangers who conquered them and those clansmen of their own who endeavored to establish their personal authority, end quote. Kropotkin placed the struggle of working-class people from which modern anarchism sprung on par with these older forms of popular organization. He argued that, open quote, the labor combinations were an outcome of the same popular resistance to the growing power of the few, the capitalists in this case, as were the clan, the village community, and so on, as were the strikingly independent, freely federated activity of the sections of Paris and all great cities and many small communes during the French Revolution, end quote. Thus, while anarchism as a political theory is an expression of working-class struggle and self-activity against capitalism and the modern state, the ideas of anarchism have continually expressed themselves in action throughout human existence. Many indigenous peoples in North America and elsewhere, for example, practiced anarchism for thousands of years before anarchism as a specific political theory existed. Similarly, anarchistic tendencies and organizations have existed in every major revolution: the New England town meetings during the American Revolution, the Parisian sections during the French Revolution, the workers' councils and factory committees during the Russian Revolution, to name just a few examples. See Murray Bookchin's The Third Revolution for details. This is to be expected if anarchism is, as we argue, a product of resistance to authority. Then any society with authorities will provoke resistance to them and generate anarchistic tendencies. And, of course, any societies without authorities cannot help but being anarchistic. In other words, anarchism is an expression of the struggle against oppression and exploitation, a generalization of working people's experiences and analysis of what is wrong with the current system, and an expression of our hopes and dreams for a better future. This struggle existed before it was called anarchism, but the historic anarchist movement, i.e. groups of people calling their ideas anarchism and aiming for an anarchist society, is essentially a product of working-class struggle against capitalism and the state, against oppression and exploitation, and for a free society of free and equal individuals.